So you want to learn about the government? Well, it might surprise you if I told you that our government hasn't always looked the way it does. In fact, it used to be very, very different. And to answer the question as to why, we're going to have to go all the way back to our nation's beginnings, the American Revolution. Let's go. Welcome to my home office, or as we used to call it before all this, the driveway. Anyway, following the Revolutionary War, the United States was facing a challenge of creating a government that could successfully pull these now independent states together into one nation. But creating that government would be harder than anyone could have imagined. So, to begin, let's look at the Treaty of Paris, 1783. In the Treaty of Paris, we officially get all of the land west to the Mississippi River, and Britain finally recognizes us as an independent nation. But in reality, even though the treaty was signed in 1783, we'd basically been independent since 1781. Because in 1781, we fight and win the final conclusive battle of the Revolutionary War, the Battle of Yorktown. However, even after the victory of the Battle of Yorktown, we're still not really pulling together the way we should. In reality, we are 13 independent colonies now who have just fought and won a war against a reasonably oppressive government. And when push comes to shove, none of these colonies really want to band together all that much. No state disputes the need to work together, but a major sticking point is all of the land west of the Appalachian Mountains. If you take a look at the map that I'm going to put right here where my hand is, if you take a look at that map, you'll see that a lot of these states have claimed all of that territory for themselves. You'll see states like Virginia, states like New York, North Carolina even. These larger states have claimed even more land for themselves west of the Appalachians. And if you look closely, do you see Rhode Island on the map? Do you see Massachusetts, New Hampshire? Do you see any of these smaller states? No. They don't have claims to that land because they're landlocked by the other colonies. And so these smaller colonies on the Atlantic seaboard, those colonies refuse to accept any new form of government until first the issue of all this westward land is settled. Well, what do you do in that situation? You have these large colonies claiming all these things for themselves. You have these small, insignificant, perhaps, colonies refusing to join. Do you join without them? Do you wait? Well, in reality, these 13 colonies are nothing if they don't band together. And so in order to move forwards, there's an agreement that is struck. All of the colonies that have claims west of the Appalachian Mountains, those colonies turn that land over to the new federal government for the federal government to decide what to do. Now that that decision has been made, they're ready to create a new form of government, and no, it's not the Constitution. Instead, it's the Articles of Confederation. In our current form of government, under the Constitution, we have three branches that all share power. Branch number one is the executive branch. That's the president. Branch number two is the legislative branch. That's the lawmaking body, or Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate. And then branch number three is the judicial branch. That's the court system, specifically the Supreme Court and the lower courts. Now, the Articles of Confederation only has a legislative body. All they have is a Congress, or the ability to make laws. And so in reality, what the Articles of Confederation sets up is a rather weak federal government that may or may not be able to hold the country together at all. Now, why in the world would they spend all this time creating a federal government if it can't actually get the job done? Well, when you think about it, what have we just fought a war for? And who have we fought it against? We fought a war to gain our independence, and we fought that war against Britain. And we did that in order to escape a rather oppressive government. Keep in mind, we were paying lots of taxes. We were welcoming soldiers into our homes under the Quartering Act. We had taxes on exports, taxes on imports. We had the Tea Act. We had the Stamp Act and Sugar Act, all of these things. And so once this war is over, is anybody going to want to have a super powerful federal government? No. And so it kind of makes sense. Now, first of all, let's look at what the government could do under the Articles of Confederation. So one, they could make treaties with Native Americans, with foreign nations. They could make laws. They could declare war. They could print money, and they could run a postal service. Now, all that sounds good. You're thinking, okay, they can make laws, that's important. They can make treaties, that's important. They can declare war, that's important. Seems like they've done a pretty good job creating this government. Now let's look at things that they can't do. They can't control trade. They can't collect taxes. They can't force states to use the money that they print. They can't enforce their laws, and they can't draft soldiers. So when you take the things that they can do and the things that they can't do and you look at them, what I hope you'll see is a pretty clear story. They can make laws, but they can't make you follow them. They can print money, but they can't make you use it. They can declare war, but they can't make you fight in it. Basically, all the articles can do is talk, talk, talk. They can't back it up. They're all talk and no action. There's no teeth. All it is growl. So they can yell all day long. They can say these powerful statements, but they can't back it up. And so it seems like a reasonably powerful government, but is it? It leaves people asking the question, can the Articles of Confederation really hold this nation together? And before long, the people will see that that answer is no. In 1786, just a few years after the Articles of Confederation came into existence, a man named Daniel Shays begins a rebellion that starts in Massachusetts, but soon has spread across many of these new parts of the United States. Daniel Shays was a former captain during the Revolutionary War. He famously fought at the battles of Lexington and Concord. He fought at the Battle of Ticonderoga. He fought at the Battle of Bunker Hill, Saratoga. And then, when his tour was up, he went home, unpaid. After the American Revolution, the nation went into an economic downturn, and the people that were hardest hit were the farmers. And that's usually how it works, because if you think about farming, farmers make their money off of the land. Typically, they don't have a huge amount of savings built up at this time in history. They live year to year, harvest to harvest. And so when the economy goes downwards, people stop buying as much food, or at least the price of it drops. And when the price of that food that they're growing drops, the farmers aren't making as much money. And when they're not making as much money, they go into debt. And when they can't pay their debts, what do they have to give? What can people seize? They take their land. And when a farmer's land is taken, they have no way to continue to make money. And so, people turn to violence. People turn to rebellion because they feel like no one is looking out for them. Daniel Shays organizes this rebellion primarily of farmers against these taxes, against the seizing of these debts. And this begins in 1786, but by 1787, it's become a pretty significant problem. And so Daniel Shays, along with 1,500 followers, marches to Massachusetts to attack and seize a federal arms arsenal, a huge storehouse of guns. If Daniel Shays and his troops capture these weapons, then it's going to make this rebellion a very serious problem after all. And so Daniel Shays and his 1,500 men stand off against 1,200 men of the Massachusetts militia. But that Massachusetts militia, they've got a secret weapon. So they open fire with their muskets, and then they bring out the artillery. And they aim the artillery at the ranks of Daniel Shays' men, and they open fire. They kill 4, they wound 20, and Daniel Shays' 1,500 men scatter, and it ends the rebellion. Now granted, they were able to end the rebellion, but it makes it very clear that the federal government is not strong enough to protect the people. Because who solved that problem? Was it the United States Army? Was it the federal government? It was the Massachusetts governor, because the federal government wasn't strong enough. And so this episode convinces people that it's time to go back to the drawing board to create a form of government that we can actually use. That's going to be the Constitution. So what we're going to do now, let's go to the drawing board ourselves and see the differences between those two styles of government. All right, so let's talk about the difference between the first form of government, a confederation, and the next form of government under the Constitution, a nation. So to do that, we need to visit one of my favorite places ever, ye old governmental pie shop, also known as the garage door. All right, so to begin, we have 2 pies. This is a whole pie. Now this right over here, now you'll notice, this is also a whole pie. So you see here, we have 2 whole pies. But I know you see it. In reality, they're very different. So this first pie here, this is what we will call a nation. This is a nation pie. Now this right over here, we're going to call this a confederation pie. Now in a nation pie, can you separate this pie into pieces? Well, no. It's not separate, it's not cut, everything is a part of the whole. But over here in the confederation pie, can you separate it into pieces? Yes, because it's been sliced. Because while it's a whole, it's only a whole because these pieces, or rather these states, have agreed to come together and form a whole pie. So over here, which is more powerful, an individual piece or the pie? Yeah, over here, the pie is more powerful. So that's the federal government. The federal government has more power in a nation. Now over here in a confederation, like we had under the Articles of Confederation, which is more powerful, the pie or the piece? Well, this pie only exists because these pieces have agreed to join together. And at any time, if one of those pieces of the pies decides it's not so happy after all being a part of this pie thing, instead it wants to take its single piece-ness and go mingle elsewhere, well then, that piece can do that. All it has to do is just pull itself out and be its own piece. So over here, which is more powerful, the pie or the piece? Well, that's the piece. And so in reality, we're not talking about pies, we're not talking about pieces, we're talking about states. And so over here in a confederation, the state is what is more powerful than the federal government. So under the Articles of Confederation, states were actually more powerful than any other form of government. Under the Constitution, we realize what we've done wrong, we realize what we have to change. Under the Constitution, we create a federal government that can tell the states what to do, that can take care of the states, and that can solve problems and keep our nation strong. And it's all because Daniel Shays and his rebellion showed us that the Articles of Confederation were too weak, that having a confederation, a government where the states call the shots, was not a good idea after all. But this is not a decision that comes easily. This is a decision that comes after a lot of debate, lots of discussions, lots of arguments, lots of probably yelling as well. Government's not easy. It's difficult to create something like this. And so we end up with 2 groups debating over the form of government. We have a group of people that believe in the strength of the federal government, and these people become called the Federalists. Okay, now the second group of people, the people who believe in powerful states, more like a confederation, we call these people the anti-federalists. Now these 2 groups of people, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, these are the 2 main groups debating the Constitution when it comes into existence. And in fact, these 2 groups, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, these become the first 2 political parties of the United States. The Anti-Federalists become the Democratic Republicans, the Federalists remain the same, and it begins this argument over states' rights versus federal power that will continue for decades in American history and color all of the major events moving forwards. And that's a real quick recap of how the United States started out with a pretty weak form of government, the Articles of Confederation, and moved towards a pretty strong form of government, which we're still under today, the Constitution of the United States. Guys, we love and miss you. We look forward to being back with you, but until then, see you next time.